I'm Dr. Lorenzo Garcia, Assistant Superintendent of Revere Public Schools. This year, January 15th, marks the 38th anniversary of the first observance of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Day as a national federal holiday. Dr. King is deemed one of the most prominent leaders in the civil rights movement, who played a decisive role in ending entrenched segregation for blacks and people of color with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Sadly, Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, but his wisdom and legacy leadership continue to guide and inspire racial justice seekers for years to come. Joining me to discuss Dr. King's philosophy of dismantling institutionalized racial segregation, discrimination, and inequity without resorting to violence, and the legacy he left for our current and future generations are our political leaders and students who will share their insights on what Dr. King means to them, to our community, and to our country.
Dr. King's contributions to not only the civil rights movement, but the official creation of the Act in 1964 are immeasurable. Segregation was easily one of our country's greatest failures. In his ability to stand in the face of immense pressure, acts of violence and terror, he became a beacon of light and hope for so many and has inspired an entire generation and future generations. As leaders, it's always important to reflect on our country's foundations and how we're able to create future foundations off of our past experiences. Dr. King and his plight will constantly grow as we embed his message into our daily work. One of my most cherished phrases is how he understood that fighting hate with more hate is not the answer. By promoting love, acceptance, and positivity as our lifelong mission and staying true to that message, I know I'm carrying on his legacy.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and go strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody will dare tell me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll tell me how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America.
From the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood, now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. Make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro has granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people.
Good afternoon.
Who stand on the warm
I'm
threshold.
Dr. Lorenzo Garcia, Assistant Superintendent of Revere Public Schools. This year, our nation celebrates Dr. Martin Luther King Day on January 15th, 2024. To reflect on and honor Dr. King's legacy, 8 high school students are joining me this afternoon to discuss the significance of Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech and how it influenced our country's history. The message of peace and justice in Dr. King's speech, I Have a Dream, delivered during the March on Washington to an estimated 250,000 people on August 28, 1963, touched many Americans. Dr. King's calls for civil and economic right, social justice, freedom, equality, and citizenship rights for blacks and African Americans, and to racism and the need of not doing business as usual. These values became one of the defining moments of our history, paving the way for the 1964 Civil Rights Act. When you hear the words economic rights, social justice, freedom, equality, citizenship, what those words mean to you? And you can start, anybody can start answering, and then you can build on what a particular student, your colleague said, and you can continue to build on that and explore more. So there's no wrong and right. That's your perspective. I want you to be calm, collected, and speak your mind.
I think that the founding fathers had a very rigid system on what rights and justice was. When we think of Thomas Jefferson, he had this idea of the pursuit of happiness, and there were 2 other ones, I'm pretty sure. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, of course. But this is kind of a very rigid stance on what freedom and justice should be, and I feel like what the civil rights movement did in the 60s, along with Martin Luther King Jr., he kind of just expanded on these ideals, which I think really elevated the idea of freedom among the nation.
Totally agree, and focusing more on the idea of citizenship, right, or even just citizen in a broad general way. Over the last few decades, we have seen a lot more of what it truly means to be a citizen. It's not just the nationality or the passport, but rather what you really bring to the economy, to the culture. And we've seen it in the United States most vastly. All the different cultures and people embedding their cultures into the United States, and also taking in, all the values that the American culture brings in into their own lives. I think that by itself, and the entire idea of inclusion, I think that's what really creates all of us citizens.
Not only that, when you look at the start of the United States, where citizenship was mostly expanded, the full extent of citizenship was mostly extended to white men with property, to eventually white men without property, to eventually women after campaigning for their rights to vote. And I feel that this speech was a landmark in the definition of citizenship, to kind of look back at how far America has come and what the definition of citizenship is in that very moment. And of course, that definition is still being defined to this day, but I think that that moment in time, this speech really puts a landmark in on a time to look back on where we have come.
Anybody else?
Adding on to that idea again, I think that speech by itself just serves as a benchmark. We can reflect on it to see how far we have come, and we can also use it in historical context to see how far from that speech we have, how far that speech has actually brought the previous America that we have always known. And so I think the vitality, I guess, in a sense, and the importance of that speech is so ingrained with how we perceive social justice, or even just leadership, for example. I think it's just so vital in that sense.
I think it's fair to say that citizenship and freedom are very closely tied together, and building off of what Sospil mentioned previously, it is honestly fair to say that the idea of freedom and what it meant 300 years ago during the founding of our nation to now, especially just looking at it on a timeline of who is free so long ago, and then Martin Luther King just advocating for these rights. The definition of freedom has always been fluctuating and just changing throughout the centuries, throughout time. And I'm really just curious to see how it'll look like years from now.
We have come a long way in terms of securing freedom, providing people with citizenship, providing opportunities, and ensuring that the whole notion of equality and equity, permeates the culture of our society and our country in general. So the question I have for you is, although we have all this progress and development initiated by the civil rights movement, Dr. King reminds us of not doing things as usual. That's an important statement because technically it's talking about the temptation of keeping the status quo, right? I'd like to hear from your perspective what that not doing business as usual really mean for our society, our community, and for our country in general.
I think it's a very descriptive aspect of America as a whole. When you look at democracy and pretty much, I guess, the founding of America, it wasn't started by just continuing on with the status quo. There was a concern among a group of people that ultimately spread into people talking about it more and eventually growing discontent with what was happening. This is not what we want to happen. We want to be able to do it this way, and eventually working towards getting that goal. And if you look at that in the context of the civil rights movement, people realize that no, we don't want to follow the status quo anymore. We want our discontent, and we want what we haven't had in the past to be seen and to be heard, and therefore we're going to talk about this and we're going to bring more attention to this issue in a way.
Totally agree, and that also drives the point of how do we grow as a nation, or how do we grow as people? Without discomfort or without stepping out of your comfort zone, you're not going to be able to grow. You're not going to understand who you really are. And I think the entire idea of civil disobedience or even challenging the status quo, that doesn't happen without us, or even just leaders, for example, like stepping out of their comfort zone to really lead us, or as even like a nation, we have to step out of these comfort zones so that we can have discussions about structural violence, like racism, like all the other ones that, press so many other people in so many different areas of life and continue to do so in today's day and age. So I think idea of discomfort, right? I think that's what leads to growth, and we need to continue to, put ourselves out there so that we can, have those conversations and create those spaces to have those conversations.
Great.
I think it's important that it's also not always that it's a politician who's doing it or someone in leadership. I think something that was done really well is that a lot of the civil rights movement was just done by the everyday people, the everyday Black people who were out on the streets and constantly dealing with racism and everything in their daily lives. And it really showed the power of congregating, bringing the masses, especially when it came to Martin Luther and the audience that he captivated just solely through his words. So it's really telling how much he was able to create change by simply, choosing to speak your mind, which is a really important skill and something that we see even now that is super important in creating change in modern times and as well as history.
Yeah, and I think it was really important for King to say that if you think that America is going to go back to how it was, you're in for a rude awakening. Because I think that it's very easy for people of privilege to ignore systematic inequalities like police brutality and racism. So I think it was important for him to say that even though this may seem like a fad almost, this may seem like just a passing movement, minorities and people of color will continue to fight for decades to come. This is a generational thing. It's not just going to end within the 60s.
So I'm going to challenge you further along those lines. So every 4 years we have elections. Every 2 years we have elections. We have our politicians standing out there defending the cause of freedom, defending a particular position in terms of, doing better for those whose voices are missing in our political discourse, right? And in our society in general. They get into the office for 4 years, 2 years, and then they end up doing the status, returning to the status quo, right? Or basically doing all the same thing that was there, the previous administration used to do. How would you overcome that? What message do you have for our political leaders and for our local leaders in terms of overcoming that mindset that when they get elected into the office, their goal is to really implement the vision that they have delineated during campaign, during meetings, town hall meetings with people, etc., etc. Because there is a tendency, it's a human being thing. You get to the position of power and authority, and you forget about the discourse you made, or maybe the promise you made, and things like that. How would you? I mean, you are a high school teacher as students. Pretty soon you're going to graduate and become leaders. How would you really, work with leaders to bring about change that and stick and basically holding them accountable?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I feel like when it comes to like leadership, the human nature, once you become comfortable, you want to stay in that same position. And I feel like what Dr. King is really trying to emphasize is this idea of like people need to be okay with not being comfortable. I feel like discomfort creates change. So advice to leaders, and that's something like each one of us could become one day, is just because you're comfortable in the position, which is like the status quo, or you're comfortable in your privilege, whatever type of privilege that could be, it's best to like look on yourself and see what are things that you're doing that are not pushing others and not creating a better environment for like others and yourself and people around you. Because yeah, maybe what you're doing benefits yourself and people you want to see, do great things, but how about everyone else? So it's really important for people to start being okay with being uncomfortable when it comes to certain things, because that's the only thing that will create change. So that's just how I feel about it.
Yeah. And not only that, I feel like if you're coming into a position of power, whether that be local government, state government, even federal government, I feel like the expectation that everything is going to be part of the status quo is ultimately, in a way, setting you up for disaster. You have to be ready, if you're accepting a position like that, to prepare to deal with something and try and figure out how to protect democracy, protect civil liberties, while also dealing with that in a manner that your constituents would want you to react in that. Kind of going off what you said, how when discontent does come up, you as a leader need to be prepared to react to that and to deal with that, while also, protecting, again, civil liberties and democracy.
I think
You can go ahead.
I think one of the most important things when it comes for political leaders to try not to, I guess, abuse their power in a way or kind of inflate their image is kind of not forgetting their connection with the people, which is a lot more easier said than done. But really thinking about your background, where you come from. If you come from a place without privilege, or even if you do come from a place of privilege, thinking about the people who aren't in the same position as you, and just building that further connection among the people and your supporters of who you're trying to gain would really benefit you, and not trying to kind of go and stray from the status quo. Because I know a lot of civil rights leaders, kind of like what you mentioned, came from everyday people, and kind of you have to take these anecdotes with you and carry them along with your story and what you're trying to do.
Yeah, I think it's also, as much as it's important that leaders, in whatever role that may be, local government, whatever it may be, although they have their own promises to keep, we need to also ensure that we as citizens, we as students, we as caregivers, whatever our role may be, that we're electing those who are, really trying to advocate for our rights and making sure that our voices are heard and that we are being seen. And if we're not being seen, we need to be able to take action. We need to engage in civil discourse and being able to have these conversations to be my voice is not being heard. How can I make it be heard? what can we do to change? You need to keep up to the promise that you promised us, because that's essentially what their position is. If you're in power, you're working for other people. If you're not working for them, then that's not your role. You shouldn't be there.
I agree with you, especially now that I've noticed that like a lot of people, when it comes to like voting for people in positions of power, a lot of the time people are like, they like put themselves in this like repetitive motion, like should I vote, or why my vote doesn't matter, like if someone else is going to vote, my vote's going to be overshadowed. We put ourselves in the status quo where we believe that as people, since we don't have position of power, that we can't change the way the world works for us in the better way, even though we have the power. Like the people that we are electing are supposed to be working for us, and I think it's very important that we need to make sure, and by us constantly voting when our elected leaders aren't meeting their standards and keeping them uncomfortable will help us always reach the demands and the requirements that we're begging for. And I think it's very important that we like escape that mindset of that our votes don't mean anything, or we don't have any power to change the system we live in.
I think part of the problem is also we don't, the idea of leadership and what it means to be a leader has just been so stagnant. Over the years, and we have seen in office and everywhere else, whenever someone gets elected to office, they think they have the ultimate power, but they don't want to acknowledge the fact that their power is nothing without the people. And I think acknowledging that and ingraining that into the next generation of leaders is what's really key here. And we do a great job with this at Revere High School. We have student senate. We're doing all this. We're ingraining that without the students, without your constituents, basically, without their vote or without their input into what you want to do, there's really no value into whatever initiative you want to lead, right? And I think we need to embrace that, and leaders going forward need to embrace that people are the core, people are at the core, and without people, their power is basically nothing.
This poem is called Martin Luther King Jr. by African-American poetess Gwendolyn Brooks. A man went forth with gifts. He was a prose poem. He was a tragic grace. He was a warm music. He tried to heal the vivid volcanoes. His ashes are reading the world. His dream still wishes to anoint the barricades of faith and of control. His word still burns the center of the sun above the thousands and the 100,000s. The word was justice. It was spoken. So it shall be spoken. So it shall be done.
I'm State Representative Jessica Giannino. Dr. King's enduring message on love, forgiveness, and peace holds a profound significance on our current and future generations. His call to develop the capacity to forgive underscores the connection between forgiveness and love. In a world facing ongoing challenges, these words serve as a timeless reminder that reconciliation and understanding are essential for progress. For contemporary America, when we look at whether Dr. King would be proud or not, it requires a nuanced perspective. And while strides have been made in the pursuit of civil justice and civil rights, challenges still persist, like racism, inequities, and divisions that demand continued efforts. Dr. King's vision of an inclusive and equitable society implies an ongoing journey rather than a destination. In today's America, there are positive signs of progress, with increased awareness and activism around social justice issues. However, persistent disparities and instances of injustice indicate that a need for a sustained commitment to Dr. King's ideals is still needed. Whether or not he'd be proud hinges on the collective actions taken to address these challenges and build a more just and compassionate society. Today's an opportunity not only to reflect on the progress made, but also to renew our dedication to the principles that Dr. King stood for. And by doing so, we honor his legacy and contribute to a future where love, forgiveness, and peace are guiding principles for a more equitable society.
The prompt, I think, is a great one about what do we think Dr. King would think of the progress that we've made as a society today. And as I look around America and I look around the city of Revere where I grew up, I think Dr. King would be very happy with where we have come as a society and where we have come as a community and as a country. When you look at the Lieutenant Governor of the state of North Carolina is an African American, the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Virginia, two deep South Confederate states, former Confederate states, and we have an African-American lieutenant governor, a Cuban-American attorney general in the state of Virginia. When you look at Massachusetts and the transformations we've had with an African-American congresswoman in Boston and a majority-minority city council. The Massachusetts legislature has the highest number of majority-minority seats in the history of the Commonwealth. It's some 34 out of 160 representative districts. I think that all of that is an example of a nation that committed itself from the Voting Rights Act to improving the quality of our public schools, to give people an opportunity, not for equality, but for the opportunity to succeed in our country and to work hard and have an opportunity to improve the quality of their lives and the lives of their children. And I think that's really, when you look at Dr. King and his legacy and what he talked about, he wanted the opportunity for people to be judged not by the color of their skin, as they say, but by the content of their character.
Hello everyone, it's Senator Lydia Edwards, and I am here to wish you a happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. This is the day that we remember a great man. We also remember great promises of our nation and that we still have work to do. It's wonderful to be able to represent such a diverse, beautiful district. And it's really important that we remember we're stronger in our diversity. And while inclusivity may have its challenges, we're still better off if we all stick together. So while we remember Martin Luther King, let's remember the work we have to do ahead, and that we should stick together and be united for our great nation. Thank you.
Yes, I believe Dr. Martin Luther King would be proud of today's America in terms of our capacity for forgiveness. He was not only a leader, but he was a believer, and he believed in the immense capacity of our nation more than most people, maybe even more than myself. So when you ask me about him, I would say that he would be very proud of where we are today, where a number of our systems throughout our communities have progressed to, our education systems, our health systems, and our penal and justice systems. Today, we seek to better them. We are very critical of where we are presently, and we often look to the past to better ourselves for the future. And I think that would have made Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. very proud.
I am so thankful for the legacy that Dr. King Jr. has left for the nation is the power of love. And love is such a huge words, and at the same time that it extends beyond what you can give, but the thing that you can do from your heart. And it is testament that during the pandemic, there's so many people and in community have loved one another, have cared for one another. We, throughout the community, from the local community to the government, that we come together to support one another to overcome this gigantic, tremendous pandemic that we did not prepare for. So I believe in the power of love. Everything that we do, from the minute we wake up, is about love, right?
So now we're going to transition to the second segment of Dr. King's speech.
Until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny.
One of the things that Dr. King talks about in this segment of his speech was the fact that he believes that the struggle must continue, right? As you heard, he believes in nonviolence approach to achieve your goal, achieve one's goal. He talks about all the work that needs to be done without really causing any harm, violence to others, right? So the question I have for you is, what's the interpretation of that segment of the speech? How and why is it so important in light of the invasion of the Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. in 2021? Do you remember when Capitol was stormed, invaded? How do you see that? How would you connect? How do you reconcile his approach of no violence? What happened in 2021 in Washington, D.C.?
I think historically, civil disobedience has been kind of a key, almost like a key component in America. With Henry David Thoreau, who kind of like invented the philosophy, and then how later on Martin Luther King kind of really embodied that through his like peaceful movements, kind of being inspired by Gandhi. So there's kind of just been like globally this connection of civil disobedience and leading protests and movements. And then in regards to the Capitol like being rioted, it's kind of sad to see how we've come from like this era of just like peacefully marching and sit-ins to just violent actions being brought on, especially just in a federal building. It's kind of disappointing.
Not only that, I guess speaking from perspective, I remember in 2021 kind of being in an online class. I was actually in my US civics class, and we were learning about the different branches of government and kind of seeing this unfold, this era, I guess, of uncertainty unfold while being in a class like that. It kind of scared me. It scared the classes. We didn't know what was going on. We knew the election process. We knew general things about it. We just simply didn't know what exactly was happening. And if you're trying to spread a message by, I guess, inserting fear and essentially getting people to be confused about what's happening, what will end up happening is people are just not going to take the message in the right way. So I think Dr. King using this and trying to bring in pacifism into the movement, I think that allows the movement to be more organized, that allows it to be interpreted by the general public and Americans across the country in a way that kind of allows them to understand more what's happening, and therefore builds on more and more support.
Yeah, I have to agree to that. I feel like in general, when there's violence, there's chaos. And when you're making a message, you're making a point, naturally when someone makes a point and the first thing they're seeing is violence, they're not going to receive your message in the clear mindset. And I feel like Dr. King makes a very good point that as people, we need to start responding to physical force with soulful force. This idea that violence is not always the answer, that there's other ways to tackle prejudice, racism, things that happen in society. So when, as people, like she said, when we come together, everyday people who are working 9 to 5s, who are doing jobs that not everybody is ideally wanting to do, I feel like that's when we create more of a force that's impactful. And it's just uniting in a sense.
And adding on, I think this is more extremely applicable in today's day and age when everyone has access to the internet. Everyone has access to, any sort of media or format of media, and things just get blown out of proportion so fast, so quickly, and it's just not controllable. And so, having this ingrained in our heads is so essential to lead to understanding and, approaching life. It's about, understanding from a macro level that, whatever action that you're going to be doing, it has to be in a way that the messaging is clear. Because nowadays, context is very important. 10-second video does not necessarily say anything, but that 10-second video is what's going to move a lot of people towards one direction. And I think that's what we have seen, in all of the issues that we've seen over the years, whether that be the BLM movement or any other police brutality cases. It's the fact that we lose a lot of the context, and which is what enrages a lot of people. So this is, I think, it's just this entire thing just applies so much to today than prior to this. So.
And I think that also brings in the idea of like making sure that we are as well informed as we can be about all these different issues that are going on, which you touched upon. Like, sure, there's a lot of things that come with the media that can be very negative, but it's also a place where we can find a lot of good and find a lot of connection to different things and find a lot of rich history and perspective. And I think that's important to acknowledge, while also like keeping in mind that all of us here, like, we're students in a classroom, and I think it's important that we're having like discussion even here today talking about Martin Luther King when it comes to when he choosing to use nonviolence in order to create change, especially when we see like things like the Capitol, like when there was the riots. We need to find a way to retrain the thinking, because I think so much of American thinking has really shifted since then, and we've gotten a bit too comfortable with how life is and comfortable with privilege, but we need to acknowledge that things aren't all too different and are really all very much of the same. So I think it's really important in finding those differences and how important like things such as like nonviolence are in order to, work with each other and live together.
I also agree that nonviolence is one of the best answers we can have, because when we do use violence to get our points across, it ends up taking away from the actual message we're trying to get to, and ends up putting all the focus on the violence that we're putting on the Capitol in this case. They used all this violence when they went and stormed the Capitol, and people weren't really paying attention to their cause. They were more paying attention to the actual actions of what they did. And I think it's just not the best way to approach things.
Yeah, and kind of adding on to that, I think in the coming months following the insurrection, there was a couple of documentaries or simply just research done on more of what happened during the insurrection, kind of how something could have been minor from coming from a rally to something being blown so out of proportion and being handled so incorrectly. And the fact that you can find more videos on that or more content on that rather than on the general message that was being presented here by the rioters goes to show how much taking the pacifistic approach could help your cause spread and be seen more positively and be seen the way that you want it to be seen.
So Dr. King said, "Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking the cup of bitterness and hatred." Those are powerful words. Am I correct? So how would you, what's your interpretation of that?
Could you repeat it?
So I'll repeat it. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred.
I feel like his message is almost saying, like, even though it's like really hard to just not go straight to like the point of violence, we have to like almost fight against that and use our own peaceful ways to get our message across.
Yeah, and I think in that he establishes sort of a connection to the experiences of African Americans up to that point in time. For example, it was very common for very violent hate crimes to be committed towards African Americans. And I think when he says to drink out of the cup of bitterness, I think that it's a good it's a good metaphor in a way to this is what we have experienced, and although we would like to exact the exact same thing that they did to us on them, it would be better for us to be the better people and to do it in a newer way that America has not seen before.
Almost in a way, I think my interpretation of that quote would kind of be to fuel that bitterness and hatred that has been used to kind of oppress like people of color during this time in history, and kind of use it to fuel the peaceful movement and kind of create it more powerful. Because it only like weaken the movement if they did like use violent means of protest. But by like being fueled by this, by the oppression, I guess, it kind of just creates a stronger message, and through these like sit-ins and march.
I also think it's important, like the beginning part of his quotes where it comes to like the thirst for freedom. I think that's also a really important thing to look at, because I think in times whenever anyone really is faced with an obstacle, you are trying your hardest at least to get over that and get past it. And sometimes you lose sight of what you're going through. And that's often where violence comes in, and where you're bashing other people or you're breaking someone down in order to build yourself up, but you're all alone in the end. So I think this thirst for hunger, he's kind of telling you that let's take a stop from that. Let's look to nonviolence and almost, in a sense, take a pause and assess where we are, assess where everyone is, and see how we can most effectively engage in communication in order to make sure things are changing.
Totally agree. And I think it also ties in with the idea of never settle. It's so easy to see when you're struggling so much, it's easy to just fold and give up to the simplest, most surface level solution to whatever your problem is. And I think the idea of, don't give up the thirst, I think that just goes on to saying you're so like wanting anything to get that freedom. But in the midst of finding that freedom or whatever the goal is, don't lose, don't just settle for what's at the surface level, but rather go deep down, look at what's actually happened structurally, and then resolve from there. I think that's what the bitterness and the hatred comes from. It's don't take in just a bit of, it's not about compromise, but rather a total solution. And I think that's what he's trying to get to.
And I'm going to close that. That's a very good point that you raised, because he basically states the following: the whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. In other words, the fight continues, right? We should not settle. The fight continues until the last breath, until you see really justice being served.
Good morning, my name is Nur Ashur. I've created a poem to commemorate Martin Luther King Jr. I have a dream, said Dr. King Jr., which would seem just like a clever scheme, but it's a speech, one extreme, by a man who was supreme, a man who was kind, a man who cared about all people combined. This is what you would expect to find from a man who uses his mind, which is true. He cared for everyone he knew, even the ones who he did not know. But it was no mystery, no. He had faith that would leave a reminder like a date, a good reminder, none shall fall, no matter who, but none at all. He had faith for us to succeed and for everyone to be freed. He yearns that the world would be a better place in the future of Earth's face. Everyone together, hand in hand, and joyous people, every strand. Let freedom ring, we all deserve to sing, but keep the future like a king. Forget discrimination, we are all one nation. That's where celebration. Don't let despair run through the air. Commemorate and treasure the past and the people that it cast, because freedom at last. We all must be mature. We will ensure. We all must endure. This poem is written by Nur Ashur.
So, whether Dr. King would be proud of racial integration and race relations today or disappointed, I think the answer lies somewhere in the middle. The optics of our situation have certainly improved from the Jim Crow laws of the South. If Dr. King were here today, he would see that the physical barriers and divisive measures that were put in place are non-existent. In fact, he would see people of all races congregating, learning, studying, eating, talking to one another on a regular and normal basis, I think he would be impressed by that. I think he would be impressed to see people of various races holding hands and having families and being accepted. I think he would be proud of those measures that society has taken. I do think that it would become immediately apparent that as a society we have failed to grasp the basic concept of his teachings, which is love.
Hello, everyone. This is your school committee member, Jacqueline Monteroso, wishing you a very happy Martin Luther King Jr. Day. As we honor Dr. King and his legacy, it's important to reflect on the sacrifices he and other leaders have made for us. If it were not for Dr. King and the many brave leaders of color who have come before us, I wouldn't be here today speaking to you as the first Latina ever elected in Revere. Today, we honor and celebrate Dr. King's legacy with a renewed energy to continue his work for increased racial equity, compassion, and love within our city of Revere. Hola a todos. Soy Jacqueline Monterroso, miembro del comité escolar, deseándoles un feliz día de Martin Luther King Jr. Al honrar al Dr. King y su legado, es importante reflexionar sobre los sacrificios que él y otros líderes han hecho por nosotros. Si no fuera por el Dr. King y los muchos valientes luchadores como él que nos han precedido, no estaría aquí hoy hablándoles como la primera latina elegida en la ciudad. Hoy honramos y celebramos el legado del Dr. King con una energía renovada para continuar su trabajo por una mayor equidad racial, compasión y amor dentro de nuestra ciudad de Revere. Happy Martin Luther King Day, everyone.
Both. I think Dr. Martin Luther King would be proud of some things, and he'd be very disappointed in some of the direction the country's taken. I think MLK would have been very proud to see the first man of color elected to the presidency in 2008 with Barack Obama. I think he'd be equally as proud to see the first woman of color as the vice president of this country, current president, Vice President Kamala Harris. So there's been some great progress made. In that regard, there's been, I think, great progress made with the youth of this country. I think the youth of this country doesn't have the hang-ups, I think, that a lot of the older generation has. And I think there's a lot more understanding and acceptance among a lot of different cultures, even in our own community from when I grew up here in Revere. So I think it's been a mixed bag, and I think we have a long way to go to honor Martin Luther King's legacy. But again, I think we've made progress, and I'm optimistic for the coming year.
What Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. relates to current and future generations about forgiveness is that how it relates to us is that forgiveness ultimately means moving forward for whatever just happened and ultimately accepting the reality of what it is. One thing that I aim to live by as someone of the current generation is that when you don't forgive, life just passes you by and you're still stuck in the past. When you get older, you realize that you've been stuck in the past for so long that you've ultimately just wasted your life thinking about something that already happened, but not looking forward, but not really looking at what's going to happen and proactively planning for that. In order to have progress in any kind of situation, you must forgive in order to move on and progress. To progress is to move forward. If you're stuck in the past, you really can't have progression.
So let's look at another clip of of Dr. King's speech and do some analysis and see what really Dr. King is telling us, what message he's conveying to us.
Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
So one of the things that you heard, at least I heard, in this last segment of the Dr. King's speech, he talked about freedom, but also there's a message there. And the message essentially is about bringing people together, right? It's a more inclusionary, bring people. We are on this together. So I'm giving you a little bit, it's a little bit analysis I gave you, but I'd like to hear from you, your perspective. When Dr. King said, let freedom ring, what that really means for our country. Here you are, you're having a country so divided, right? We're talking about almost over 50 years ago, right? And country so divided. Discrimination every corner that you go. Blacks being mistreated, harmed. Violent happened in our city. You have this civil rights movement led by Dr. King, trying to change things. Remember the whole piece about the status quo, right? Change the status quo. It's time for us to change our country for the better, right? So then, all of a sudden, Dr. King is talking about bringing this kind of conciliatory tone of bringing people together, right? No violence. So things that we already discussed, right? Talk to me a little bit about, this changing of position. Maybe it's not a change of position. So talk to me a little bit about it.
Well, I think something that I really honed in on, and as you mentioned, was let freedom ring. It's part of repetition. In his speech, he says it multiple times over. And I think it does play a huge part of the speech, especially when you think a bit about the symbolism of what let freedom ring really means. In my head, when I first heard it, I thought of a bell, kind of. Of course, you ring a bell. But when you hear a bell tolling, let's say you're walking in Boston, and you hear the bell from the Park Street Church go off, and you hear it get progressively louder as it starts to hit far into the city. Like sometimes you can be across the commons and hear that bell. I think that when I hear let freedom ring, I think of how a bell will slowly chime louder and louder and louder until the entire city can hear the effect of the bell and have an idea of what is being spread through that messaging.
Yeah, and I also think that the metaphor of the bell also draws back to that wrestling with the status quo and that discomfort, because you need to also be comfortable with having the bell ring. No matter how loud it is or how powerful it is, you need to be comfortable with the sound of freedom.
And I think even looking on beyond the bell, because bell is one interpretation, and even letting that your voice ring in a sense. So when you hear freedom ringing, it's your voice ringing, and I think that's something very powerful that Martin Luther King was really good at, especially when you see any of his speeches. He's able to get a crowd's attention, and I think even many other activists during this time were able to do that so well in order to captivate all of these people's attention and really create this change and get it going.
I totally agree with that idea of the bell symbolizing voice. I think the idea is if you don't speak up, no one's going to speak up for you. And if you're not the one who's going to, advocate for yourself, no one's going to do it for you. And we see, teachers tell us this all the time, and so do all other leaders, that, you have to stand up for yourself if you want change. And I think that's what's really driving at this point. And I think it can also kind of symbolize, because it's almost the end of his speech, a sense of hope that at the end there is light, and that light could be freedom or whatever the bell you may think resembles. And I think that driving that point that yes, we might have so many struggles, we might have so many adversities going through this process, but at the end we're going to triumph some way. And that's what's really going to drive a lot of the freedom and a lot of the hope and a lot of the free thinking that all of us really want to express and put out there.
Anybody else?
I also agree, and I think that going along with the bell idea, I think it can also like represent like having your voice be loud enough for it to ring. And when you said freedom ring, I think it's like almost like using our voice to be loud enough and powerful enough to spread it throughout the whole nation.
And I think it even goes beyond letting your own voice be heard. It's inviting other voices to you to invite them to that table. So it becomes this congregations of voices, is a louder bell, a louder noise, in order to create a louder effect and like a ripple of change that becomes bigger and bigger. Which I think is something that he did really well, especially in this movement, and also things that we see now with everyone, the need for everyone to come together, especially in times of oppression and injustice. It's important that we have other people that we can rely upon and come together on. And I think that's what he even gets on even further when it comes to like having people come together despite their race, their faith, their ethnicity, and all standing as one, uniting as one, to really create this change.
Even building off of that, I think it's really important that people, like, no matter of their background, even if an issue just affects a specific group of people, kind of like what Isha mentioned, kind of just having this like large group and consolidation of people from all different kinds of backgrounds. Like even furthermore in that speech, he talks about like Catholics and Protestants joining together and Black people and white people joining together, kind of just emphasizing that idea that even though the civil rights, the segregation, like really only affected people of color, he's still acknowledging like the people who are in positions of power, how their voice can still help the movement and help everybody, no matter like who's being oppressed in the situation.
For sure, because I also want to make it a point that he does say 1963 is not the end, it's the beginning. So I feel like sometimes when people are in a season, when they see change, they feel like, okay, well, this is the end. Well, I feel like as people, we have to acknowledge that just because things are getting better doesn't mean it stops there. Every year, even if it's 2050, like things need to change, things need to get better. Because I feel like something that people don't acknowledge, I hear a lot of people say like slavery was such a long time ago. Well, the civil rights happened, so everything's fine. But I feel like people don't acknowledge that hatred is so deeply rooted in so many people. So as people, we need to understand that every day within ourselves, whatever we can do to change ourselves and better our mentalities and ideas, we should also help others. Like whether that's inviting other people in a conversation or just sitting down and thinking, what can I do as a person to do better to help my future generation or just society around? So I feel like it's really important to understand and take.
That's absolutely true. The minute we become complacent, the minute we stop, that's where we tend to slide back to the status quo. I fully agree with you. I could not agree with you more than that. So I have one question that intrigues me, which is the following. How's Dr. King's legacy influence the Black Lives Matter movement? Black Lives Movement.
Can you just repeat that question?
How Dr. King's legacy of freedom, of let's say peaceful protesting, no violence, use of no violence strategy to achieve your goals, influence the Black Life movement?
I feel like what Dr. King did definitely influenced like the just like movement in general, whether that be Black Lives Matter, because I feel like when people experience so much prejudice and like hate from others, sometimes people can consume that hate and become bitter. And I feel like that's a really good point that everybody has talked about. Like we don't want bitterness to be something that consumes us. So I feel like people have used that to fuel them and understand that not everything needs to be physical. Sometimes things can just start off from a conversation and be impactful and become a protest in the sense of peaceful protest. Maybe that's boycotting certain businesses that are supporting hatred and prejudice and racism. So I feel like Dr. King's legacy is living to this day because we're all young high schoolers who are eventually going to become young adults and most likely parents. So that's just something that's very important.
I agree with what Francois said. And not only that, I think that it also brings into the aspect of what status quo can really do. For example, I hear a lot that when the murder of George Floyd happened and it was all over the news, a lot of people thought that the Black Lives Matter movement only stemmed out of that one singular event, when in reality, it was years and years of years of timely events happening that ultimately led to kind of a bottle effect of something happening, and then a community is outraged to the point where they don't want another tragedy like this happening. They need action now. And I think what that kind of shows about status quo is when you go back to a status quo, you're essentially allowing that thinking that there's nothing else that is happening. Everything is normal. Everything is fine. When in reality, we're just kind of hiding what's really happening. And I think that now with the Black Lives Matter movement being more prevalent in today's age of modern technology, I think that allowing people to kind of see what has been happening, to kind of view what else has been happening under their quote status quo, it allows the public to be more educated.
Soon, you're going to be leaving Revere High School, maybe a year from now, maybe others this year. You are leaders. You are young leaders of our community, of our school, Revere, in our country. So give us some specific recommendations upon leaving our school system. What's some of the recommendations, or what you have in mind in terms of continue to build on what has been done on Martin Luther King's legacy, to continue to make our country stronger, our community stronger, where everyone feels appreciated, included, and everyone feels that they are part of something. So this is going to be probably 1 minute answer.
I can jump in right super quick. I think we need to first show students that there is value, and from that value, passion stems. A lot of the success of student leaders in this building has happened because of their passion. I don't think we don't have any other incentives to do anything else, but it's the passion within us which has led to any of the changes, initiatives, or anything else to be brought up to school committee or the principals or any other body that oversees the functioning of the school. And I think that passion is what is lacking in a lot of students, especially those coming in. And I think we need to first show them that there's a value in the school, and we have to show them that if you do the right things and if you step up, then there is something at the end that will benefit not only you, but those around you. And I think, we don't necessarily do a great job of that at this school right now. And I think moving forward, that's something that teachers or there should be a discussion in every classroom. It's about how to become a good leader, not just, the captain of something or the president of this club. It's about how can you really utilize those positions so that you can better the entirety of school and create a community.
I agree with you, Ryan. Another thing besides just passion, I think a lot of people in the school forget that they need to use their voice. I hear a lot of students always complaining about things that they don't like in the school, but when it comes to actually taking a step forward and creating some type of action or plan to change these problems to make the school a better environment for everyone, they just tend to fall flat and they enter back into this status quo of, the school is not doing anything for me and it can't change because I don't want to use my voice and advocate for the things that I want in the school. And I think it's very important that besides passion is that every student here uses their voice, because this is not just a space for the school to do whatever they want. It's a space for us and it's our environment, and we all need to use our voice to make the most out of this environment alongside with the passion that we have in the school to make RHS probably one of the best high schools you could ever go to.
And my mentality is, if you're complaining and just not doing anything about it, you're essentially kind of digging a hole for yourself. I feel that when there's an issue that presents me, now that I have gotten the experience of what it's like to be a leader at RHS, I feel more empowered to do something about it. And I feel like other students in the school also need that empowerment, that and also that knowledge that they can do something about it. You don't have to have a certain position in power or to be especially big in the school to have a concern about something and do everything in your power to try and fix that. I think it's important to use your voice, and also important to just know that if there is something that you think should be done, then it can be done.
For sure. Like, I agree with like Chris's point and Sasabel's point, because I feel like in general, advice who I would give is don't put yourself in the box. And I feel like a lot of times as teenagers, when we see a leader, we think a leader has to have the best vocabulary or has to be like, like you said, like the captain of a team. Everyone can be a leader. Everyone is a leader. It just depends on how you carry yourself and the message that you just talk about, and just advocating for yourself. If you don't like something, like Chris said, talk about it, speak on it, because everyone can do something. So the more that people advocate for themselves and don't put themselves in the box and see the leader within themselves, things will change, things will get better. So that would be my advice.
And I think in a school, I think it's most important because school is meant to be a place where you foster and grow like young leaders, because we are the next generation. So it's important that we are people who have passions, as Ryan said. But I think a lot of the times we just need to make sure that the environment around us is also building that up, and we're being as powered as much as we can, because especially like after the pandemic, I know everyone took a giant hit, and especially students. It really things when it comes to our attention span, our grades, or like different things, a lot of things, just like even if you look statistically, have dropped. But in order to get that up, it does stem from your own like self-determination and your desire to see something new and see something different. And I think we have so many students who are so great at that, but I think we have so many students who have the potential to be even greater if given and presented those opportunities. So I think it's so important that everyone has the chance to get their voice and know that their voice can be heard and should be heard, and making sure that as administrators, teachers, and even like students amongst our friends, making sure that we're helping everyone be able to build that voice and build it stronger.
Thank you. That concludes our conversation. I'd like to end our conversation on Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy with a big message to all of you of deep appreciation. You are future leaders of our country, future leaders of our community, future leaders of our school. And the answers you provided today, just with us in this probably 30 to 45-minute conversation, really shows clearly that we are great students with great intellectual capacity, understanding of the current issues. And I really appreciate it. I hope that you can serve the model for other students. Even when you do graduate, you can come back and be a guest speaker for our students. Thank you. I truly enjoy this conversation. I look forward to do more things with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, a little black...
I hope that the views and perspectives shared by our guests on Dr. King's teachings, leadership, and legacy of nonviolence to combat social and racial injustice have laid a solid foundation for a more inclusive, integrated, and racially disaggregated America. I encourage you all to reflect on this important day and to continue to work towards creating lasting change that will benefit all members of our diverse community. Lastly, I would be remiss if I did not thank Revere TV, our school district, and distinguished guests for their meaningful contribution to this important discussion. Eternal honor and glory to Dr. King. Thank you.